64 to 65, he's now 29 to 30 years old. Moves into the family home in Geelong. Always a black sheep, he becomes estranged from his mum and his sister from this point on. Family letters from mid-1864 reveals that he had a wife or a quote-unquote bad woman, according to his sister Emily, and this is likely a reference to the already married Sarah Barber. She was born in Dublin, and she's sort of a mysterious figure in his life, but is known to have remained Will's lifelong partner, which is obviously with him when he died. The de facto nature of their relationship and even Barber's existence were probably kept a secret from Will's mother for a number of years. Throughout the 1965 football season, Wills played for and served on the committees of the Melbourne and Geelong footy clubs, which were then the most powerful in the competition. Kind of still are.
Still are, yeah.
At the end of the winter, beset with public brawls over which team owned him, Wills moved to Geelong for the remainder of his career, prompting the Bell's Life in Victoria to report that Melbourne had lost, quote, the finest leader of men on the football field. The following year, when the running bounce and other rules were formalised at the meeting of club delegates under Harrison's chairmanship, Wills was not present. His move to Geelong had cut him off from the rule-making process in Melbourne. Intercolonials between Victoria and New South Wales resumed at the MCG on Boxing Day 1865, nearly 3 years since the Sydney riot. Sam Costick, William Caffin and other Victorian professionals defected to the rival colony due to pay disputes with the MCC. Wills led the weakened Victorian side to an against-the-odds win. He took 6 wickets and contributed 58 runs.
That's a big score for those days.
It was the first half-century in Australian first-class
Oh, there
cricket.
you go.
The Victorians ended the match with 285 runs, a new record. Will's batting style drew mirth from the observers again, as his bat stuck to the earth like a dead stump. This is that weird, awkward batting style we're talking about again. Sounds like he's just holding the bat. Yeah, I think I saw something where he said the ball can't go through the bat. So he's holding it in front of the wickets, protecting it. I wonder if he had a backswing at all. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. That you have the idea of the forward lunge and the lunge and the quick punch of the ball, into the ground, to go past the fieldsman and all that sort of stuff.
So almost always stepping up to the ball.
Yeah.
So that's probably why they called him the Punisher.
Well,
Yeah. Allegations that Wills cheated his way to victory failed to endanger his status as a folk hero and a source of eternal hope for Victorian cricket. 66 to 69, he's hit his 30s now, he's 31 to 34. On May 8, 1866, Colton Harrison, captain of the Melbourne Football Club, chaired a meeting of footballers of Melbourne to review the rules of the game. Tom was not at the meeting. However, on the same day, another event quietly took place. The minutes of the MCC meeting include one item that would change the course of Tom's life. And quote, it was agreed to allow R. Newbury to use the ground for 2 days during the month for a match with the native Black 11. The resulting team was initially coached by local pastoralist William Hayman. The motive behind the match set for Boxing Day that year was a financial one, and in August, Wills agreed to coach the Aboriginal players. He travelled inland in November to gather the players from Edenhope and Harrow, which has a beautiful museum, apparently, that I've never been to.
Yeah.
You ever been there?
No, I haven't.
We should do a trip
there.
Yeah. They were mostly Jawajali men. They shared common vocabulary with the neighbouring Chaparong people, which enabled Wills to coach them in the Aboriginal language he learned as a child. So he's retained that language.
Yes.
From their training ground at Lake Wallace, Wills, in a tactical strike, boasted to the Melbourne press of the Aboriginal players' skills, especially the batsmanship of Unamuriman, commonly known as Mullah. Uneasy over Wills's claims, the MCC strengthened the ranks of its Boxing Day side with non-members, which is kind of a bit dodgy in a way. It's like they're calling in the guns for hire, so to speak.
Yeah.
This attracted widespread criticism in the process. Public sympathy was with the Aboriginal players when they arrived in Melbourne in late December, and over 10,000 spectators went to the MCG to see them play. Captained by Wills, they lost against the MCC's reinforced side, but won unanimous praise for their performance. Wills afterwards accused the MCC of treachery for getting these pinch hit players. The team provoked much public discussion over past mistreatment of Aboriginal people and future relations between the races. It is unknown what Wills and his Aboriginal teammates made of these broader social or political dimensions of the enterprise. Some of Wills' contemporaries were shocked that he would associate with Aboriginal people in the shadow of his father's death. Others, such as this contributor to the Empire, addressed him as a hero, and this is what they said in the Empire. Although you may not be fully aware of the fact, allow me to tell you that you have rendered a great service to the Aboriginal races of this country and to the humanity than any man who has hereto attempted to uphold the title of the blacks to rank amongst men.
Yeah.
Wills' role took a symbolic significance. Supporters and critics alike used his status as a native Australian-born colonist to identify him with his native Indigenous teammates, and he was also noted for speaking in their own lingo. Jellicoe, the team jester, joked to the press, "Wills too much along of us. He speak nothing now but blackfella talk." While Melburnians were enthralled by Wills and the Aboriginal team, the annual intercolonial between Victoria and New South Wales, usually the season's highlight, failed to excite public interest, and Victoria's loss in Sydney was partly attributed to Tom Wills not being there. The Aboriginal players improved as they toured Victoria under his captaincy. In January, after an easy win against Geelong, Wills took the team to Bellevue to meet his mother.
Right, there you go.
This must have been an interesting meeting.
It would, yeah. She would have not known where to put herself, I think.
Yeah, because obviously her husband has been
murdered by Aboriginal people.
But she's still living in Bellevue, so she's probably near the chaperone, but not really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Back in Melbourne, 2 members, Bullocky and Cousins, joined Wills in representing Victoria against the Tasmanian XV1. What's that? 16.
16.
In February 1867, they went to Sydney to begin an intercolonial and overseas tour. Aware of the tour's lucrative potential, New South Wales captain Charles Lawrence, who took Tom all around Ireland as a kid, played county cricket, invited the team to stay at his hotel on Manly Beach. Their first match against the club at the Albert Ground in Redfern halted dramatically when policemen entered the field and arrested Tom Wills. He and W.E.B. Gurnett, the tour promoter, had been vying to take over as manager, and Wills ended up in jail for breach of contract. Within days of his release in March, Gurnett embezzled some of the funds and left the team stranded in Sydney, dashing any hopes of a trip overseas and confirming Wills' suspicion that he was a con artist. Lawrence set up a benefit match for the team and joined them on their travels outside Sydney. By the end of the New South Wales leg of the tour, he had usurped Wills as captain. No longer attracting significant crowds or media attention, they returned to the Western Districts in May. Lawrence stayed with the team while Wills went to Geelong to play football. It has been said that, due to his drinking habit, Wills exercised a bad influence upon the players, 4 of whom died from illness during or soon after the tour. The inquest into one death, that of Watty, and a follow-up police report found evidence of alcohol abuse amongst the players. So he's having a drink with them.
And joining in, and they're joining in with him, and it's been shown that Aboriginal people do not process alcohol as a food like other people, and so Aboriginal people get disproportionately can be disproportionately affected by alcohol.
Yeah.
So what he was doing was frankly irresponsible and dangerous, but he was an alcoholic.
But it was also what he did with his sporting mates his whole life.
It's exactly right. He started drinking at age 14 in rugby college.
Yeah.
Because the English water was so
Drinking while
bad.
they're playing cricket, drinking where they're here, The surviving members formed part of the Aboriginal 11, which Lawrence took to England in 1868, making it the first Australian sports team to travel overseas. Wills resented Lawrence for reviving the team without him. His exclusion from the landmark tour has been called the tragedy of his sporting career. Might have been a bit different if Tom went over there.
Yeah, it could have been, but who knows whether he would have been able to, modify his drinking and all that sort of stuff. He could have been a fantastic contributor because his knowledge of Aboriginal culture, ability to relate to them, and that sort of stuff. But despite that, they had a fabulous record while they were over there, the first Australian team to beat the English at cricket.
In travelling to England, the Aboriginal team played 47 matches throughout England over a period of 6 months. They won 14, they lost 14, and they drew 19. A good result that surprised many at the time. How do you draw a cricket match?
Very easy, because you can be thrashed for 5 days, and then if you haven't bowled the other side out, you draw.
Okay, so it's not really a loss.
It's not a tie.
It's not a tie.
There's only ever been 2 ties in Test cricket history.
These agile players I've got here fielded the ball on the run, threw on the turn, and sent bullet-like flat returns to the keeper, leading to often surprising runouts.
And this is what used to, in England, it was, you'd have a saunterly, jaunt down the cricket after you'd play the thing and trot off, and all the Aboriginal players could throw the ball 100 yards, and they'd hair off to the boundary, catch it, throw it in, and the person would be halfway down the wicket, W.G. Grace style, thinking that they were safe, and all of a sudden they got run out.
So it says here, the star Johnny Muller topped the batting and bowling averages for Australia, and after 150 years, his achievements have been recognised with the Johnny Muller Medal being awarded to the best player at the Boxing Day Test of the MCG.
Look, people don't realise what a fabulous player Johnny Muller was. Aboriginal people have the best eyesight of any race in the world. They can see things and track movement and whatnot. He was so quick with his eyes that if anybody bowled a bouncer to him, all he did was take a half step forward, put the bat on his shoulder, let the ball pass the back of his head, hit the ridge of the bat, fly over the keeper and go for 4. Like he could watch the ball go past the bat. What sort of guts do you have to do that?
You've got to be confident.
Because anybody trying to bounce him, that's what he'd do. He'd just forward and it'd bounce off the ridge of his bat and go for a 4.
In addition to playing cricket, the Aboriginal players frequently put on an exhibition of boomerang spear throwing at the conclusion of matches. Dick would also hold a narrow, parrying shield and invite people to throw cricket balls at him, which he warded off with the shield.
That's right. And that's, again, Aboriginal people have this fabulous eyesight. And he'd just stand there, people be 10 metres away, throwing the ball full force at him, and he'd just be moving the bat a little bit and just deflecting the ball away. And that was only just one of the things. One of the longest standing record in athletics history in the world was the Tarpot, one of the team, ran the 100 yards backwards in 14 seconds.
Choice.
I defy Usain Bolt to do that.
Yeah, 14 seconds, 100 yards. What's
backwards?
Yards and metres is roughly
it's just only 3 inches short of a yard is 3 inches short of a metre.
The Aboriginal team were narrowly beaten in a cricket ball throwing competition by an emerging English all-rounder of star quality, a 20-year-old W.G. Grace, who threw 118 yards.
That is amazing, because all the Aboriginal guys, as I said, could throw 100 yards. They all could. And for W.G. Grace to throw 118 yards is amazing.
You can see that's why he's remembered as one of the greatest cricketers.
Well, he's regarded as the greatest cricketer of all time.
1870 to 72, he's 35 to 37 now, which is about the time most AFL players retire. You can play cricket till you're about 40, but
Yeah.
Hardly a year had passed since Wills returning to Australia in 1856 without public comment on his suspect bowling action. Such comments increased as he aged and turned professional, and by 1870, many former allies that had once colluded to protect him, including journalists and officials, now accused him of deliberately throwing. Now, It never says whether he bent his elbow or it goes above, so I'm going to assume when we talk about this that it could be either of those things. Wills's fame and influence helped make him a convenient caricature of the cricketing villain, one that his critics urged ought to be no-balled for the good of the games in the colonies. In February 1870 at the MCG, Wills captained Victoria to a 265-run win over the New South Wales side, featuring Tuapenny, an Aboriginal paceman allegedly recruited by Lawrence as a foil to Wills's chucks. Comparing the two, the Melbourne Press surmised, undoubtedly Wills throws sometimes, but there is some decency about it, some disguise. In March, Victoria trounced the Tasmanian 16 in Launceston under Wills's leadership, though not without criticism of his bowling action again. Amid accusations that Wills had incited a plague of throwing in Australia, one-time ally Hammersley, now Melbourne's foremost sports writer, emerged as his harshest critic. He accused Wills of resorting to throwing to maintain pace as he aged and criticised him for introducing a type of bouncer designed to injure and intimidate batsmen. Does that mean he invented the bouncer?
Close. What I was saying before, to bowl round arm,
you said the
and,
cricket,
and you also lean your body to one side. It means you can elevate your arm and get it into the pitch harder. So, yeah, sure, I reckon he invented the bouncer.
Well, you're saying that the bouncer was bowled at Johnny Muller, though. So it was probably part of it, but it sounds like he's perfecting it.
Yes, that's right, yeah. Oh, well, the bouncer is bowled short and to rear at the batsman's body.
The Australasian, which is Hammersley's newspaper, surmised Wills by saying, "If I cannot hit your wicket or make you give a chance soon, I'll hit you and hurt you if I can. I'll frighten you out."
The model for Lillian Thompson.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Dennis Lilly was the guy with the really long run-up, yeah?
Yes, that's right.
And Thompson had the fastest ball ever until...
A Pakistani.
Yeah, Shoaib Akhtar.
Yeah, that's right.
In the face of a looming crisis in his career, Wills admitted to throwing in his 1870-71 Australian Cricketer's Guide, and in doing so taunted his enemies to stop him. Nonetheless, he was the captain of Victoria in March 1871 against New South Wales, held at the Albert Ground. In the first innings, he scored 39, but was offset by his drunken behaviour in the field and seemed reluctant to bowl for fear of being called. Victoria won by 48 runs. Not long after, Wills was no-balled for throwing for the first time in a club match. Rumours soon spread that the opposing club's owner had conspired with the umpire against Wills. A series of superb cricket performances in February 1872, including a single innings 10-wicket haul for 9 runs against St Kilda, removed any doubt that Wills would play for Victoria in the next intercolonial match against New South Wales. Before the game, representatives of both colonies met and entered into a bilateral agreement designed to call Wills for no balling. When he opened the bowling, Wills became the first cricketer to be called for throwing in a top-class Australian match.
And Ian Meckiff followed suit many years later.
Who's Ian Meckiff?
Ian Meckiff got called for bowling. He ended up writing a book called Chucked Out, But he was a great bowler, but he was a bit double jointed, and so they decided.
So his elbow went past.
Yeah.
He was again no-balled when a Victorian side under his captaincy lost to a combined 13 from New South Wales, Tasmania and South Australia in late 1872. Hammersley had seemingly triumphed in his campaign to have Wills banned from intercolonial cricket. In an exchange of personal attacks in the press, Wills implied that Hammersley was the architect of the no-ball plot and protested that he and other English colonists were out to oppress native-born Australians. Wills went on to threaten him with legal action, and Hammersley closed with this: "You are played out now. The cricketing machine is rusty and useless. All respect for you is gone. You will never be captain of the Victorian 11 again. Eschew colonial beer and take the pledge."
That means take the pledge to go off the grog, give it up.
"And in time your failings may be forgotten and your talents as a cricketer remembered. Farewell, Tommy Wills." 1973, he's 38 years old. He's about at the end of his
1873.
1873, I should say. He's at the end of his sporting career now. W.G. Grace, the Victorian era's most famous cricketer, brought an English team to Australia in 73 to 74. Wills strove to play for Victoria against Grace. Hammersley was a selector and ensured that he missed out. However, Wills didn't care, and he went on tour with and played against the Englishmen in as many teams as he could. Irked by Wills' constant presence, Grace remarked that he seemed to regard himself as a representative of the whole of Australia. It is assumed that on his homeward journey, Grace would play a final match in the South Australian capital of Adelaide, but he bypassed the city when Cardinia, a remote mining town in the Copper Triangle, offered him more money. Wills coached Cardinia. He went there, the miners, captained them against Grace's 11. He played in an open, rock-strewn plain of baked earth. The game was deemed a farce. Wills made 2 runs in the match. Grace neglected to mention that Wills bowled him for a duck, ending with 6 for 28. That field must have been insane. Like, you can imagine a rock-strewn dirt field. The ball hits the ground, it's going to blow up dust in your face. I can just see it as a cinematic experience. This like horrible Mad Max, like apocalyptic ground.
Well, exactly
and
right.
This 38-year-old man coming up against the best cricketer in the town, and even though he goes out, he still bowls him. I love it. Back in Geelong, Wills is still idolised, though he seemed discontented, seeking any chance to earn money through cricket in the major cities. He maintained an interest in the development of football, what he called the king of games. He continued to suggest rule changes such as the push in the back to curb injuries, and he helped shape the sport's playing style. Utilising the speed and skill of Geelong's young players, which they still have, Wills devised an innovative game plan, what he called scientific football, based on passing and running to open space. He pioneered another tactical manoeuvre in Ballarat, ordering his men to flood the back line to prevent the home side from scoring.
So it was Tom Wills that invented flooding and not Terry Wallace.
That's right, in the Essendon game. Having enraged the crowd, he and his men incited them further by wasting time and deliberately kicking the ball out of bounds.
Johnny Beckwith style.
Yeah, what was it? Johnny Beckwith, you were telling me about him.
Melbourne, back pocket player, and he used to kick the ball out after a point, and he'd make sure that it'd go out of bounds so it'd get thrown in. So they changed the rule that if it went out, then you got a free kick for the other side.
That's right. I remember that happening to me when I was playing football. One of my mates kicked it out to me. It was just a little too far. It went out of bounds, and the umpire blew his whistle. He said, "No, it's his free kick." I was like, "What do you mean it's his free kick?" So that's how.
That's the Beckwith rule.
The Beckwith rule. Yeah.
It's like the Kevin Bartlett bouncing the ball and
that's
being
right.
tackled rule.
Which is ironic because he's on the rules committee now. Anyway.
You've got to be good to have a rule named after you.
That's very true. Or you've got to exploit the rules to have a rule named after you. A few years later, in a rare act of diplomacy, Wills quelled tensions after a rival club used his unchivalrous tactics against Geelong. So if you do it, then I can do it.
Yeah.
He played his last football game ever in 1874. After his ejection from top-class cricket in 72, the Victorian 11 suffered a streak of losses against New South Wales. In 74 to 75 Cricketer's Guide, Wills argued that Victoria needed a new captain. For the first time in years, Wills' names appeared on the Victorian selectors' short list of players for the next intercolonial match against New South Wales. Noting his faded skills and sullied reputation, the Melbourne press lamented, "There is some sentimental notion afloat that as a captain, he is peerless." Peerless?
Peerless, yeah. They've got no equal.
Pessimism gave way to hope as Wills promised to restore the colony's glory. And in February 1876, he led the Victorian 11 onto the Albert Ground, Sydney. Batting last in the order, he went for 0 and 4 and failed to take a wicket despite bowling the most overs of his side. The media blamed him for Victoria's 195-run loss. In turn, he blamed his teammates. So he's pretty much lost most of his sporting ability now.
Yeah.
He's getting to that stage, which is a really sad moment for any top-class sportsman.
Absolutely. You know, his reflexes are gone.
1877 to 1880. So he's 42 to 45 years old. By 77, Wills' cricketing career had become a series of petty disputes in petty games of ever-deteriorating standards. No longer an office bearer with Corio, he moved amongst lower level clubs in the Geelong area, earning scrapes of money wherever he could. In a brief postscript to one of several rejected applications for employment at the MCC, Wills gave voice to old cricketers, left in the cold, and an unmistakable backhander from the club. After retiring as a footballer, Wills turned to umpiring and committee work, and despite his continued slide into debt, donated money and trophies for football competitions. So you got a broke drunk who still wants to support. He just loves this game so much.
That's right. And he wanted to be known and remembered. So even though he was broken in debt, he would give prizes and awards and things like that.
He served as Geelong's vice president from 1873 to 1876 and briefly as club delegate after the 1877 formation of the Victorian Football Association, but was dropped for unknown reasons. There's a lot of these unknown reasons, but I'm thinking...
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. During the 1878 VFA season, he acted as a central umpire and defended his adjudication of a June match between Carlton at Albert Park in what would be his last public letter. That year, Wills, broke and hounded by creditors, began selling land in Geelong to help clear his debt and moved with Barber to South Melbourne. He held no positions of power at the South Melbourne Cricket Club and only occasionally appeared in local team lists, but managed to convince the club to open its ground to football in winter as a means of improving the turf's durability. So that idea of playing on the grounds to keep them nice and hard.
Yeah.
Like the part in the middle of the footy ground was the most horrible spot to play football on.
Yeah.
It was always a spot that I scraped up my knees or ripped my elbow. You never wanted to be tackled in the middle of the ground where a cricket pitch used to be.
No.
Other clubs soon followed South Melbourne's example as football adapted to an oval-shaped field in the late 1870s. So he brings it to the cricket grounds.
Yeah.
It's his influence that does that. By this stage, the sport had spread throughout Australasia, with Melbourne matches attracting the world's largest football crowds yet seen.
That's right. And Australasia means that there was actually competition in New Zealand.
New Zealand, yeah.
Yeah.
In late 1878, the MCC rejected Wills' last application for employment, and his dwindling income from cricket was finally asphyxiated. From February 1879 onwards, Wills lived with Barber in Heidelberg, a small village on the margins of Melbourne, which is where my dad grew up, actually. His life that year went largely unrecorded, and he made only 2 trips outside Heidelberg after moving. One of these, in January 1880, Tom Haran saw him at the MCG during an intercolonial between Victoria and New South Wales, so he still went in to watch the cricket, even though he wasn't playing. His alcoholism worsened over this period, as did Barber's, also a heavy drinker as well. He occasionally coached the Heidelberg Cricket Club. Its members composed mostly of farmers. I love that. Heidelberg is a place where farmers are. On the 13th of March 1880, he played in the side against the Bohemians, a travelling circus of wealthy amateurs, in his last game of cricket ever. Wills took 5 wickets, his chucks working sweetly on the rough pitch. I've got a really old picture here of the Heidelberg football ground. I'll put it up. It's crazy to not see anything but just paddocks. You know. In his last surviving letters, sent 2 days later to his brothers on Cullinan-Ringo, he wrote that he felt out of the world in Heidelberg and fantasized about escaping to Tasmania. Begging for money to help pay off debts, he promised, "I will not trouble any of you again." Isolated and estranged from his family, at age 46, Wills had become an incurable alcoholic. Tom and Sarah Barber abruptly stopped drinking on the 28th of April 1880, and it is presumed that they ran out of money to buy more. 2 days later, Wills started to show signs of alcohol withdrawal, and on the 1st of May, Barber, fearing that a calamity was at hand, admitted him to the Melbourne hospital, where a physician treated him for delirium tremens. Delirium tremens, I've got here, is a rapid onset of confusion usually caused from withdrawal from alcohol.
And hallucinations.
Yeah, when it occurs, it is often 3 days into the withdrawal symptoms and lasts for 2 to 3 days. Physical effects may include shaking, shivering, irregular heartbeat, and sweating. People also hallucinate. Occasionally, a very high body temperature or seizures, colloquially known as rum fits, may result in death. And it says alcohol is one of the most dangerous drugs to withdraw from.
Mm.
Later that night, Wills absconded, returned home the next day. In the grip of paranoid delusions, he committed suicide by stabbing a pair of scissors into his heart 3 times.
And that's just so graphic that he's, he wanted to kill himself because his heart was breaking, and the guts and determination to actually stab yourself 3 times in the heart is just unbelievable. There's 2 ways of committing suicide, and the first is a passive way of just wanting to die and things to go away. So people will choose drowning or gassing themselves. But when people have an internal hate of themselves and what they are or have become, then they want to destroy themselves and they'll blow their head off, or they'll use extremely violent means of killing themselves. And that's what obviously Wills was going through, this trauma that he hated what he'd become and he wanted to destroy what it is that he'd become.
You're right, I never heard it described like that. That's a hate for yourself.
Yeah.
When you stab yourself like that.
Yeah.
The inquest on the 3rd of May found that Wills killed himself when of unsound mind from excessive drinking. His burial took place the next day in an unmarked grave in Heidelberg Cemetery at a private funeral attended only by 6 people, those being his brother Egbert, sister Emily, and cousin Colden Harrison. Harrison's sister Adela and her son Amos, and cricketer Bernie Cameron later ran an unsuccessful fundraiser for a tombstone over his grave. Pretty sad end to that story.
It is. It's such an iconic figure in Australian sport, both in cricket and football. And as we were saying before, he hated what he'd ultimately become.
Yeah. So, in 1980, his unmarked gravesite was restored with a headstone erected by the MCC using public funds. He was inducted in the Australian Sports Hall of Fame in 1989 and became an inaugural member of the Australian Football Hall of Fame in 1996. The Tom Wills Room at the MCG's Great Southern Stand serves as a venue for corporate functions. Statue outside the MCG, sculpted by Lewis Lawman, was erected in 2001 and it depicts him umpiring the famous 1958 grand football match between Melbourne Grammar and your old friends Scotch College. The AFL commemorated the 150th anniversary of the match by staging the Tom Wills round during the 2008 AFL season. The 2 schools played in the curtain raiser at the MCG ahead of the round opener between Melbourne and Geelong. It's such a big game, the Melbourne Grammar versus Scotch College game. If you've been any part of those schools, that is the sporting calendar event of the year.
It is the Cordner Eccleston Cup.
Yeah, which is I have been told is probably the oldest sporting trophy in the world that's played between 2 clubs. That same year in 2008, Australia's busiest freeway interchange, the Monash Eastlink interchange in Dandenong North, was named the Tom Wills interchange.
And every time I go through that, I tell everybody this is the Wills interchange. Yeah.
Tom Wills Oval, inaugurated in 2013 at Sydney Olympic Park, serves as the training base for the AFL's Greater Western Sydney Giants. I've got a bit of a surprise for you. I've got an essay here written by a former student of mine.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I might read the essay to you and see what you think, and then we'll give him a score out of 50. How's that sound?
Okay.
So, the first Australian rules game was a match between Melbourne Grammar and Scotch College on August 7th, 1858, in a parkland outside the Melbourne Cricket Club in Richmond. The match was played over 3 Saturdays, where it ended in a draw with 1 goal for each side. The schools selected their own umpire for the game, with Scotch College selecting Dr. John McAdam and Melbourne Grammar selecting Thomas Wentworth Wills. The new game, Australian rules, was credited to Tom Wills, who had recently returned from the rugby school in England, where it is claimed that he got the ideas for the game from. Wills was known to be a talented rugby and cricket player. He suggested that the game could be used to keep cricketers fit during the winter. The Melbourne Football Club was formed in 1858 and Geelong Football Club was established in 1859, with rules being agreed on by a committee on the 17th of May 1858. Whilst the rules were initially believed to have been adapted from rugby to Australian conditions, more recently new evidence has been exposed about the potential influence of Indigenous games on the sport. Some historians of Australian rules argue that there is an undeniable relationship between the Indigenous football games, including Marngrook, and Australian rules, whilst others refute any relationship between the two games. When Australian rules first began, Wills proclaimed that he had generated an idea from playing rugby in England. The sport had been adapted because of the hot Australian weather, which made the ground a lot drier, therefore harder than the luscious paddocks of England. As a result of the conditions, Wills had to change the game to remove the risk of injury to the cricketers. Hacking, kicking or tripping an opponent was banned, scrums were removed from the game, and those who caught or marked the ball in the air were rewarded with a free kick. Players were allowed to run with the ball until 1865, when the players had to bounce the ball at least every 10 metres. As opposed to rugby, there was no offside rules, and the ball was to be kicked through 2 goalposts instead of having to run past a line. In 1891, the centre bounce, used at the beginning of the game and to restart the game after a goal, was introduced into Australian rules, which makes it unique to other similar sports. Despite some similarities between English rugby and Australian rules football, there are some distinctive differences. Proponents of the notion that Wills introduced Australian rules football based on English rugby centre their arguments on the lack of documented evidence to support any Indigenous influence. Roy Hay, one of the game's historians, believes that the idea that Indigenous football was somewhat a blueprint for the game that the white men developed in Melbourne around the late 1850s. I have searched high and low, and many other historians have done the same, to find out if there is any subsequent evidence that supports that, and really, we can't find any. Similarly, Dr. Greg Moore, a football historian, has not been able to find any evidence of connection between Indigenous games and Australian rules in 10 years of research. De Moore stated that, I have found nothing that documented that Wills saw the game. He never made reference to it, and no one else has ever made reference to it. It is argued that there is no evidence that Marngrook was played in the area where Wills grew up, whether or not he saw or played Marngrook, and that the rules of Marngrook influenced Australian rules. The overwhelming majority of the written documentation from this period was written by the British settlers and reflected their point of view. Therefore, these historians base their position on colonial experience of the European settlers as being the only perspective from which history can be told, and that the absence of documentary evidence of the link between Marngrook and Aussie rules means that there is not any. Some historians believe that the Indigenous played Australian rules with the European settlers, but the game originated with the Europeans. Roy Hay gave out this idea that it was the Indigenous who made their way into the white man's game rather than the settlers being influenced by Indigenous football. The main argument is that the Indigenous people joined in Australian rules as soon as it began amongst the colonisers in the late 1850s. The Indigenous survivors who were left in the missions and stations around the periphery of Victoria saw the white men playing their game and forced their way into it. In Roy Hay's opinion, there is evidence that the Indigenous played Australian rules with the colonists, but no evidence that they played a similar game by themselves prior to European settlement. The Australian Football League historical opinion was that there is no influence by the Indigenous on Australian rules football. Gillian Hibbins, the AFL historian, was commissioned to write a piece for the AFL's official 150-year history produced in 2008, and she stated that Australian rules football was not related to and had not been influenced by the Indigenous game Marngrook, and that any such suggestion is a seductive myth. Whilst Hibbins admits that it would be appealing to see a relationship between Aussie rules and Marngrook, she proclaims that it was derived solely from colonial origins, even though there are many differences between Aussie rules and English rugby. Hibbins also noted there was no documented evidence to make the connection between Marngrook and Aussie rules, as there is no mention in the existing family documents or for those of his fellow football founders. On the contrary, there is much evidence to show that Wills in fact favoured rugby school. The reluctance by the AFL to admit any links between Indigenous football and Australian rules remains the official position based on the controversial views of Hibbins. The views of historians that believe that Marngrook influenced Australian rules are largely based on evidence about the childhood of Wills. They argue that Wills grew up in the Grampians region where he befriended Indigenous people and was exposed to the Indigenous game of Marngrook. Jim Poulter introduced the thought that the indigenous game of Marngrook contributed to Aussie rules back in the 1980s. His great-grandfather had grown up with Wurundjeri people following mass disposition of the traditional lands and devastated by smallpox in 1852. Poulter's grandfather participated in the final intertribal corroboree on Wurundjeri land at Pound Bend in Warrandyte, where he experienced an Aboriginal football game. Poulter himself played in the centenary game for Scotch College against Melbourne Grammar in 1858 and became interested in the history behind the game. His research led him to James Dawson, who arrived in Melbourne in 1840 and established friendships with the Indigenous, including the Chaperong, which was the tribe amongst whom Wills lived. Dawson provided several references to Aboriginal football played in the intertribal corroborees at which the Chaperong were present. This suggests that Wills may have experienced such Indigenous football games with the Chaperong people. Further, the diaries written by William Thomas, the protector of the Aboriginals in Port Phillip, in 1852 to refer to Indigenous football match at Pound Bend in 1852. The diaries revealed that the players did not throw the possum skin ball as the white man might do, but kicked it high with the top of their foot, and some of them will leap as high as 5 feet or more from the ground to catch the ball. These sources show that there is a real possibility that Wills was influenced by the Indigenous game. More recently, further evidence was discovered in 2017 which gives greater credibility to the view that Wills was exposed to this Indigenous football game of Marngrook in his youth. Transcripts found in the State Library of Victoria revealed an interview with John Connolly, a Muckjudawant man who portrays his experience playing Marngrook in the Grampians region in the 1830s and 40s. Johnny Connolly's eyewitness account was found amongst papers of the ethnographer A.W. Howard and reveals, in playing a game of ball which they kicked about, the different totems presented two different sides. The impact of colonial settlement on the Muckjudawant people was significant, and their culture was lost through disposition and violence along with their history. This primary evidence strongly suggests that Marngrook was played amongst the Indigenous prior to the European settlement. There are many historical references to suggest similarities between Marngrook and Australian rules. These indicate that there is a connection between the games. In particular, keeping the ball in the air, kicking it high, and marking are distinguishing and common features. As described by William Thomas, the ball is kicked up in the air and caught, and when the ball is caught, it is kicked up in the air again by the one who caught it, which suggests that some of the rules of Marngrook were included in Aussie rules. However, some historians, including Roy Hay and Dr. Greg Demore, dispute this relationship as they believe that for the first 20 years of Aussie rules was played as a low, scrimmaging rugby-style game. However, this is contrast to an unpublished letter by Wills to his brother which supports the view that Australian rules football had always been a game based on keeping the ball off the ground. A significant amount of evidence supporting the relationship Marngrook had on Aussie rules is circumstantial, as it is oral history passed down from Indigenous elders. The culture is to pass down history through song, dance, stories, and art, which makes some people doubt the evidence. Combined with the devastation of Indigenous communities that occurred upon European settlement, most, if not all, documented evidence is by Europeans, whilst the history from the point of view of the Indigenous has been lost. Tita Seacombe, an Indigenous elder, remembers the stories of Marngrook that her grandmother and aunties told. The stories were about Marngrook being played at the foot of the Halls Gap in the Grampians, where many tribes would come together. Tita Seacombe recalls that someone would pull out a possum skin ball, they'd stand in the centre of the oval like it is today, and each goalpost made up of spears. Based on oral history, Indigenous communities believe there is an undeniable link between Marngrook and Australian rules. In 2019, AFL changed their position on the history of Aussie rules and proclaimed that it was influenced by Indigenous games. The Indigenous footballer Adam Goodes was apologised to by the AFL for not supporting him during his career in the relation to the racism he experienced and the impact of the disposition and disempowerment of the Indigenous and their community. The AFL said Aboriginal history tells us that traditional forms of football were played by Australia's first people all over Australia, most notably in the form of Marngrook. It is Australia's only Indigenous football game, a game born from the ancient traditions of our country. The AFL now strongly support the undoubted influence Marngrook had on Australian rules. Jim Poulter considers that Wills did not reference Marngrook in creation of AFL rules because society at the time could not cope with the idea of adopting an Aboriginal games, so Wills said that he invented the game. Due to racism, the settlers felt superior to the Indigenous and therefore the game would not have been accepted if Wills had given credit to the Indigenous for the game. Ultimately, there are still two sides to the debate about the Indigenous influence on Australian rules football. There are some historians who believe that the game was not influenced by Marngrook and that it came solely from Wills and his experiences at the rugby in England. Other historians believe Australian rules was influenced by Marngrook based on stories from Indigenous elders and evidence that links back to Wills when he was young. Whilst the Indigenous and many historians believe that Marngrook influenced Australian rules, some of the racism that has existed since the settlement by Europeans still remains and needs to be addressed and universally adopted.
Well, that's terrific, and I would give 49 out of 50.
Well, I've got a couple of things you've got to mark him on. So his use of evidence out of 10.
Use of evidence out of 10 was 10 out of 10.
10.
I thought it was really well balanced, yeah.
His historical understanding out of 10. So a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the subject matter.
At least 9.5.
Yeah, 9.5, okay. Adherence to the essay structure. So introduction, arguments, conclusion.
I thought 10 out of 10.
Written expression, clarity, vocabulary, variation of sentence length.
Yes, again, 9.5 out of 10.
Mechanics, punctuation, and spelling. He had no spelling mistakes in there. Couple of little comma issues. That was about it. So 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10.
Well, that brings us to the end of our podcast, Jim, because I can hear your dog wanting your attention. Thanks for taking part in this with me, Jim. I've had a great time.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Dan.
Yeah. Thanks, mate.